Hi everyone, Gail Dawn here. Welcome to my sewing space. This is another in our series of short instructional videos, and the topic for this one is going to be a bound buttonhole. I learned how to do them what feels like 100 years ago, but probably in the 1970s, with a completely different method. And I've sort of adapted my own method by using piping to make them, and I feel like it's a little bit easier to master. I'm going to just talk through, I've got some sample swatches here, and I'm going to talk through the steps that you would need to do. A bound buttonhole is such a nice choice on a tailored garment. For sure on something like, I just pull up a couple of things here. Something like a traditional wool coat, a bound buttonhole is an excellent choice on a garment like that. It can also be a design element on a project. This set, it's a dress and jacket set done in navy blue twill, cotton twill, and I elected to do a bound buttonhole out of the tartan on the jacket, which really mimics the shape of the double welt pocket, and it becomes a design element on your project, as well as solving the problem of making buttonholes at the very end. So what you're going to need to start out with is you're going to mark your buttonhole on the right side of your fabric. And you would want to be working over interfaced fabric. You wouldn't want just a single layer of your jacket fabric. In the situation of a wool coat, I've got one partially constructed here, and there's more significant interfacing that goes into the construction of the coat. I've got a piece of fusible hair canvas on the front of my coat, which provides a lot of stability, but it would be a big problem to try and make a bound buttonhole through all that weight. So I've cut little windows out of my hair canvas and patched them in with something called French fuse, which gives me a nice little opportunity here to put my bound buttonhole in. So, marking on the right side of the fabric, you would mark the beginning and the end of your buttonhole placement, and that would be marked on the front of your pattern. Generally, center front is going to be falling about 1/4 of an inch in from the edge of your buttonhole on something like a coat. The length of your buttonhole is determined by the diameter plus the depth of your button. So if you have a button that's 3/4 of an inch across and 1/4 of an inch thick, you would need a 1 inch length buttonhole. I just use old-fashioned dressmaker's chalk to mark these. Sometimes the old school methods are the best. I don't want some kind of a chemical pen that is perhaps going to leave a residue behind. So you're going to mark you've marked the beginning and the end of your buttonhole, the vertical lines, and then you're going to mark the horizontal midline. In this case of my sample, I'm making a 1 inch long buttonhole. You want to draw in a line that's 1/8 of an inch below your buttonhole and another line that's 1/8 of an inch above your midline. So here's my midline. I drew an 1/8 out here and an 1/8 out here for a total of 1/4 of an inch from here to here. And that number doesn't change whether you're working on a piece of cotton twill or a piece of heavier wool. That 1/4 inch number stays the same. You're then going to make a piece of piping that is thicker than what we would generally use when we make mini piping on a project. I put 2 layers of filler cord in this, started out with 1 inch bias and just wrapped it around the 2 cords and moved my needle over enough that I was stitching 1/8 of an inch away from the turn of the cloth here. So you want a full 1/8 of an inch taken up in the piped part of this strip of piping. I used filler cord that was a little bit heavier than what I would use to make mini piping. I tried several things. I ended up going with just a cotton yarn that's a number 4 weight. It's 100% cotton. It's nice firm texture to it. And I just picked this up at a place like Joann's. And it's a thicker cord than what I would use when I make mini piping. So you're going to make your piece of piping and check that you've got that full 1/8 of an inch from stitching line out here to the rolled edge. And then you want to trim your seam allowance down to an accurate 1/8 of an inch. So you've got an 1/8 of an inch of seam allowance. You've got an 1/8 of an inch of rolled piping. If you put a ruler on that, it measures out at exactly 1/4 of an inch. And it's important that you maintain accuracy doing these steps, or your buttonhole won't end up filling in properly. So I've taken one of those trimmed piping pieces and I have laid it so that the raw edge of the piping lines up to the midline on my buttonhole marking. And eventually I'm going to take a second piece and put the raw edge of the second piece at the midline. And what happens when you do that is your stitching line, which is right here, stacks right on top of these 2 outer marked lines. I found it was pretty helpful to take a piece of Wonder Tape. It's a product that looks like this. It's a sticky basting tape that you can pull the backing off and have it sticky on both sides. I just used the one side of it for this. And line your basting tape up to your vertical lines. Gives you a real definite stop and start point. I would recommend that you use your piping foot when you go to stitch this down, because it's going to ride right over that double cord, and you will adjust your needle over so that you're stitching right on top of the stitching line that held that piping together. Make sure you back stitch at the beginning. Go forward to your basting tape and back stitch again. You've got to have some security here and here, and then you'll just turn the foot around, come in the opposite direction, being sure to back stitch here and back stitch here. Then pull the tape off. At that point, you'll have something on the right side of your fabric that looks like this. And if you flip it over, you should see 2 parallel lines that are 1/4 of an inch apart and that stop and start on the same vertical line. If this one exceeded this one, you would have missed your start point, and that's where the basting tape comes in. So they have to stop and start on the same line. Very carefully from the back side, you're going to slash through your base fabric. When you get down here, you don't slash right out to the end of your stitching. You stop and do a Y cut right out to the stitching here, right out to the stitching here, the same here at the other end. So you've got this is how it's going to look on the front. When you flip it over, that's how it looks on the back. You're just going to take those 2 pieces of piping and drag them through, making sure you've got all 4 ends here. Drag those 4 pieces of piping through to the wrong side. When you flip it over, you'll be pleased to see that you have made yourself a bound buttonhole. We still haven't sealed off these 2 ends yet. That's where you build the stability into this. To finish off one of these end pieces, because we haven't stitched anything here yet, you're going to fold the jacket or the whatever you're working on back on itself. That little triangle will be exposed, and you're going to do a line of short, tight stitches that come straight. I went over, back, over, and I made sure that those stitches came in right at the base of that triangle, and I also made sure my two pieces of piping were kissed together here on the back side. And that's what reinforces those corners. I'll show you another little bit of a close-up. Here's another one that's done. It looks a little thicker on the wool because the wool is a thicker wrap around the piping, but the measurements and the process were exactly the same. And you get a nice traditional looking corded bound buttonhole. If you're thinking ahead to that looks great on the front, what are you going to do on the back? Because you're either going to have a lining or a facing or something. You will want to mark, if this was my lining, I would have poked pins through at the corners here into my lining and drawn a little box on my lining, put down a piece of silk organza. It's really pretty sturdy stuff, but it's sheer and it's fine. And done some short, tight stitching around that marked box, slash down the middle, clip out the corners. Once it's pressed open, there's your little clip corner sticking out there. It creates this little window, and that would line up to the back side of your buttonhole, and that would get hand stitched in place. So that's a quick little overview on how to make bound buttonholes. If you haven't made any in the past, get out some scraps of fabric and see what kind of success you can have. Appreciate you watching this. Keep stitching.